Yes.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Alliance on the Move. Today we have a special edition program with two very prominent Guyanese, Dr. Kimani Nihusi and leader of the Alliance for Change, Mr. Kemraj Ramchatan. This program follows one that we had 3 weeks ago, to which there was significant demand for part two and a continuation, because in that program, you'll remember we did not complete the discussion that we had with Professor Nihusi. So, welcome to everybody. This is a special edition of Alliance on the Move. It's a guest edition, as you can imagine. Welcome, Professor. Welcome, Kemraj. As you know, sorry.
And thank you very much, Nigel.
Right. So, as everybody knows, in Guyana, the question of race has loomed large. Before we started talking about national politics back in the 1950s, you may recall in the last program, Professor Nihusi spoke a lot about the genesis of this race challenge that continues to be perpetuated and continues to affect our political life. And so I perhaps want to start with asking both of these gentlemen. I'll start with Professor. What would they consider, or how would they describe, I should say, the state of race relations in Guyana today?
Should I start? The professor can always back me up. If
or
I
disagree,
may,
as the case may be.
yeah, well, coming out of a budget scenario where we just completed the debate last night, it did give me a more pronounced sentiment as to what basically at the economic and policy level is the state of affairs of race relations. I spoke about it and I indicated that it is not very good. I will just give it a pass mark, and I am pretty liberal with these things. But there have been certain policies in that budget and a continuation of some which indicates that there is a propensity of our present government to ensure a certain discriminatory impact in relation to the bounty that we now have. And that has to do with the oil monies. And to the extent that that was largely in my head over the past week, I will deal with it a little more, but I will put it that it is not really in a good platform. Too many of the reliefs are being distributed in a discriminatory fashion, and too many of the policy orientation, even that upping of the $20 million low income mortgage that they're saying that they would like financial institutions to help out with, it seems to indicate, well, it was argued that it indicates a beneficiary class that is $156,000 and more per month. And a lot of our public servants do not reach that status. And to the extent then, in relation to certain other policies and so on, Nigel, I can't put it in a very good stead. It is pretty bad.
Okay. Professor, I know you don't actually currently live in Guyana, but I know that you follow developments in Guyana. How would you describe the current race relations in Guyana?
I would say that the current race relations in Guyana are deplorable. And what the Honorable Kemraj just said is a description of current reality. And there's no way any one of us could reject that and be honest and truthful. But there's another level at which race relations in Guyana is even more disturbing. And I'm talking now about the structural level. And that's why I'm urging that Guyanese need to step back and study how our society has developed And then we're going to see that the state has consistently favored certain groups while not favoring other groups. And even within that, some groups were less favored than others. And it's ridiculous in a way that we're comparing how different groups have been fared. Because let's cut to the chase. The two major groups in Guyana are Indians
Yeah.
and Africans. And all of us, both groups, as well as Portuguese and Chinese and indigenous Guyanese, have been exploited by colonial powers, by Europeans. And they have tricked us so deeply that today we're fighting against each other rather than trying to find out what really happened, how we have come to this path. And I'm going to say something that might be provocative to some people, but I hope I provoke them into thought. It doesn't matter which government comes to power now, and it doesn't matter how evenly that government tries to distribute the oil resources that have inflamed so many passions. Some groups are still going to be left behind. And I'm talking about African Guyanese now who've had our culture, our identity disrupted, who don't know who we are, and who, as a consequence, will never be able to contribute as much as we can to ourselves, our families, our communities, and our country. This
Uh,
doesn't mean that attention shouldn't be given to other groups. We have a lot of working people who need urgent attention. So I think that we really need to step back, study our country, study ourselves, and have a new dispensation.
I
Development is about people. It's not about plenty roads and that kind of thing. And if we don't develop our people, we cannot develop our country. Sorry if I ran off a while.
No, no, no. I thank you for that because you've identified the point of intervention where I want to start. And I want to pick up, I want to start with a quotation from your book, A People's Political History of Guyana, 1838 to 1964. I'm not plugging your book, but I want to suggest to every Guyanese that this is mandatory
Yeah.
reading. Absolutely important if you really want to understand where we're coming from. So I'm going to your chapter 11, which is called Sheddy Jagan and Forbes Burnham in Colonial Guyana, The Formation of Political Personalities in a Plantation Society, 1918 to 1964. Allow me to just read this quotation, and then I don't want to spend, because we spend an awful lot of time talking about Cheddy and Forbes in the context of their roles, which either may be oversized. What I really want to do is I'm quoting this as a platform to begin a discussion that hopefully will begin to identify how we can begin to solve this issue of race in terms of Guyana contemporary times going forward, the economics, the societal development, education. So this is a quotation from your book at page 431. You say, "It is the greatest pity that since 1955, these have usually only, sorry, there has, these have usually only ever been contending and hardly ever collaborating forces. That is a condition which our two champions were apart. It came through them, but it was not from them. For neither man was the author of the destructive values, attitudes, and behaviors that were imposed, instilled by the plantation over many centuries that began before their birth." And you're talking there about Cheddy and Forbes. I just want to make it clear that what you say there, forgive me, I think it was quite clear, is that neither of these men actually started this problem, but of course they were of the problem. And I think you so eloquently said in the last program that in terms of pure politics and getting votes, if the appeal to race is going to deliver votes, then you can't, not that you couldn't fault them, but you can understand why politicians go there. So my question to you, and I start with you, Professor, is given the role of both Cheddy and Forbes, both of whom have been dead for a long time, both of whose contributions are beyond question to the nation state of Ghana, given their contribution, the what is your position on the adverse impact of their respective political leadership when they were either in power or contending for power on contemporary Guyana? And then after you've identified that, I will ask both you and Kemraj if you can start to talk to how we begin to identify some problems and then with a view to finding solutions.
Thanks, Nigel, for a very beautiful question, because it's usually very difficult for us to answer a question like that. And it plays into and up to my appeal to us to stand back and understand our country. The point about Chedi and Forbes is that they were more similar than they were different, because both of them belong to plantation politics. They tried to break out of it, but ultimately, both of them were, shall we say, captured to a great extent by plantation politics. And by plantation politics, what I mean is divide and rule. I mean playing up the race card. I mean all of those things that mark plantation society. They may not have been consciously and deliberate proponents of all aspects of that. But as leaders and as a nation, we failed to triumph against or over plantation politics. And that's why our country is still in the state it is. We have not transcended plantation politics to this day. Part of the solution has been given to us. And I want to talk about the ultra left in the original PPP when you give me the chance, Nigel, as part of the solution. But our values in Guyana are still colonial values to a great extent.
But,
We,
can I just at that point, not meaning to interrupt you, but I am interrupting.
Please do, please do.
Say this. Both of these, Burnham left us in 85, and I think Chetty left us in 97. That's at the best, that's at least 30 years ago. We have had several political leaders since. Just before Burnham left us in 79, I think Rodney was here and Rodney left us. Surely, unless there has been an absence of equally powerful and dynamic political leadership, I would have thought that 30 years was more than enough time for the political class, and Kemraj, I see Kemraj kind of half smiling, for the political class to start a conscious discussion with the population about changing plantation politics. But has it changed?
Let me step in, because I tried as best as possible within the PPP structure, which was literally haunted by the ghost of Jagan. And that is also, in my view, what has happened. The PNC is haunted by the ghost of Burnham. So uprooting yourself out of these two political parties will require a special intellectual effort that sometimes the leadership of the party try to strangulate. That is the new ideologues who like to be sitting on the ghost of Chetty and Burnham. And to that extent, we seem incapable of transcending the ethnic gravitations that the two parties exploit, especially for winning the votes and winning the various seats in parliament and at regional council and even at NDCs.
But Kemraj, the answer to that is, and I'll ask you directly, are you saying that the political leadership or class in Guyana has failed to get rid of plantation politics for the last 30 years? Let's take from the death of...
I will have to answer yes, because it is so acculturated into us. And it is not a difficult thing. You will need paradigm shifts in so many aspects of the matter. I remember going and talking to sugar workers. Why you want to continue with the punt and cutlass mentality now that we have right-sized sugar? And all of them gave me a serious beating until you start historically talking to them. It's a group of fellows we were having a chat on the issue in Bobby's. And it's only after you really can settle down and tell them a whole lot of the history and where we're going now, especially with the oil sector and all of that, then they come to realize. But they themselves get hooked, like, as if it is an opioid, and they want that kind of thing. When you ask them about their children, do you want to go and let your children use the cutlass and then is when you also start seeing some differences. But again, I may not have been the best capable at that stage to tell them out of it, but they still ended up saying, man, some of our jobs. I said, but before you can come out of your jobs, we had to make certain economic decisions. It is only after a while, going back, chatting with them on the television and on telephone and so on, that some of them say, I think I see your point now. I see your point now. But
But
it is an extremely difficult task.
so do you first of all concede that our political class has failed to move the politics of Guyana away from plantation politics?
Yes, I will say that we have
Okay.
failed
Okay.
because of the fact that we are in the state we are.
Forget the reason. My
Mm.
question, my next question to both of you is this: if after 30 or 35 or 40 years, whatever it is, despite the best efforts of what we have thrown up as the political class, because there's no point wishing for a different political class. We have to deal with the reality of what Guyana has, and it clearly has not thrown up the leadership that seems to either want to challenge or believes that the plantation politics is bad. What then is the history? What then is, sorry, the future of this country in terms of race and politics, given that plantation politics appears to be the way in which we're going to go forward? Can I go to Nehusi and then I go to you, Kemraj?
Yeah.
Thanks, Nigel. I want to do you a slight disservice and comment upon the previous question.
Sure, not a disservice at all. This is about.
All
Actually, I
right.
want to say this to Kemraj because both of us, the guests, I have to applaud your leadership and the Alliance for Change for having this real discussion. And the reaction to Professor Nihusi after the last time was tremendous.
Yeah.
And I think it is an important discussion to have. So there's no disservice to my question at all because I think it's part of the.
Well, it's
the
within this. And
Go
I,
ahead.
I have to join with you, Nigel. I said this at the last program, and I think it would be seriously remiss of me not to repeat it in front of the leader Kemraj's face. This is an important discussion. I do applaud the AFC. I applaud any group of Guyanese who say we want to discuss this thing intelligently because it's perhaps the most important question facing our people today. And it's very responsible to put this on. And I don't mean myself alone. I hope we could have some ding dong discussions on this. But reverting to the previous question, Rodney didn't leave us, he was taken from us. And
forgive me.
What Kemraj was doing with the Indian sugarcane workers was grounding with them, was touching bases with them to show them where they're coming from, to help them understand their own story. And I think it's important for us to pause and recognize what was happening there, because this illustrates the failure of our education system. Our education has not been comprehensively graduated to address the learning needs of our people. So, sugar workers, after so many years of so called independence, still don't know enough about themselves. And it's not only sugar workers. So, this question of how do we fit in to Guyana today? Where should our nation go? Too many of our people are not equipped to answer that kind of question intelligently. And this announces the failure of the political class, because the political class
But
is
Professor,
willing.
let me interrupt you there.
Yeah.
A politician, a pure politician who's only interested in power, forget this grand thing about development and country, will say to you, the one reliable basis for the delivery of votes on either side has been race. So when I look at the data, if you tell me don't appeal to race, I will not get the same level, or I fear I may not get the same level of votes, then you can understand instinctively why they may go there. So I just want you to factor that in your continuation of your response.
Yes, I understand that, but I don't agree with it. And that's the thrust of my last
You don't agree that
appearance.
race delivers votes in Guyana?
Sorry?
You do not agree that race delivers votes in Guyana?
Yeah, I agree with that statement, and I understand it, and I understand why politicians go for race. But when will the adults stand up in the Guyanese political culture and say that just appealing to race is not sufficient for our people? We sell
But
ourselves short.
but
And it's
but sorry, Professor, but aren't
important.
you answering your own question there just now when you said when will we educate ourselves differently? And the
Yes,
real no,
yeah.
the politicians are going to say to you, why am I going to educate the population so that they become intelligent, see my game, and no longer vote for me?
Well, then they're mature politicians who are going to go to the people and break the stranglehold of race. And this is where I want to remind us that this solution was detailed in our nation's history over 70 years ago by the ultra left in the original PPP. Martin Carter, AUC Koyana, Lionel Jeffrey, Rory Westmus, and Eric Huntley.
But
These were,
see.
could I finish this, please?
No,
Because
I was just going to ask you to talk about the ultra left. And the other thing about the list of names you gave there is that several Indo-Guyanese may challenge it. And I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to take the advantage
okay,
because a lot of people don't know about it, the ultra
right.
left.
I would like to get any challenge, and maybe I could learn something, you know. But the ultra left in the original PPP were those gentlemen, and they said very early, do not let us participate, put candidates in all the 24, I think, seats. Rory Westmus said we could get 18 or 19 seats. The party got 18. Those guys, and I'll repeat the names, Martin Carter, AUC Koyana, Rory Westmus, Lionel Jeffrey, Eric Huntley. There were others on the fringe. They said that the most important question facing our people at that point in time, unfortunately, it still is a question of race. And that we should not try, meaning the original PVP, should not try to win power and get into the National Assembly. But the major effort should be on working among our people to promote understanding among the races. Both Burnham and Jagan said, if we fighting to win. This was a declaration of an intention to seize political power. It doesn't matter so much whether we agree with them or not. We have to be of a certain disposition to try to know as much about our past and learn the lessons offered by that past. Whether we agreed with Barnum, those of us who may or may not have been around, and not very many people were around were around then. But if you agree with the Jagan approach, the Jagan and Barnum approach, or you agree with the Quayana and Martin Carter and others approach, the ultra left approach, to me it's very obvious that it was a serious error to neglect interracial relations, to neglect learning and teaching about each other. And that's why we're having this discussion today. As a nation, we have failed miserably to move out of plantation politics that taught us that to be different was to be somehow inferior or superior. And this begins, and we need to stress this.
Look,
European,
if I may
go ahead.
butt in, it is important in view of the fact now that, okay, there have been missed points in relation to our history, we have as best as possible an opportunity as we go on this journey of creating a community, or creating a society, that we try as best as possible, knowing all that which passed in the history, knowing the names that you call had come up with certain prescriptions and so on, that we, in the context of what I regard as a development from those days, a one man, one vote scenario, whereby, prior to when the PPP came into existence, it was a lot of property rights you had to get. Women sometimes couldn't vote and all kinds of things. But having a scenario of a democratic, whether it is a fragile democracy now, we have basically and at least the attributes of a democratic order. How do we affix the wrongs or right the wrongs in the context, and so that we could move forward? Because I feel that we can miss another boat by not utilizing the existing scenario, which is going to be the reality for a long, long while. We can't go and tell PNC leaders or PPP leaders, here, to win, you got to avoid the racial voting patterns. You got to try something new. They're going to tell you to haul your tail. And so we're not going to get there. What we got to do now is, in that context, see how best we can remedy the situation. I feel that the person who was supposed to be on today, Ravi Dev, had some very good suggestions in that context. And the more that I saw what happened in our budget debates, the more I see the necessity of it, so that it could help incrementally solve our journey away from plantation politics. And it is having, in relation to all
Can
these
you just
economic issues,
articulate, Kemraj, which one of the Ravidev proposals you're talking about? So
the
you're
ethnic audits in
right.
relation to economics of the country. I think it is a wonderful idea, and he has spoken much about it. I really wanted him to talk about it today. We'll
Oh
probably
no,
get him another time.
let me just say to your audience that Mr. Dev is going to come. It was just that we thought that we wanted to complete the conversation we were having with
Okay.
Professor Nehusi, and it's my fault that he's not here today, because I wanted to complete that discussion so that when Ravi comes, and I will say publicly, Ravi did accept. I called him, messaged him, so that's going to come. And I think, like you, I think Ravi is a very important participant in this discussion, and I certainly would like to have Ravi and Professor Nehusi on together as part of this guest
I
series.
accept that.
So
Just
go
to
ahead.
complete my thought, and we'll go back
Yeah.
to Dr. Nehusi, because that's what he's talking about is most interesting. It is like, you're doing a feasibility study, or an ethnic audit is the equivalent of it in the context of the economics I'm talking about. So if you're going to do a certain housing process, make sure that there isn't segregation, and that could only be done by an ethnic kind of audit. If you're going to do flood relief or a fisher folk relief, let us see how best it is spread around and distributed as ethnically equitably as possible, and things like that. And so I feel that, yes, Dr. Nehusi is very well in line. We ain't come out to this plantocracy politics. It's the colonialism that has embedded the thing in us. And that is why when we read law, where it come from is England again. The right to property is no different from what we had even in colonial days and so on. So you're going to have that imprinted in us and there for a long time. But we too have to try as best as possible to intellectualize and come out of it by creating certain new values, or also new systems, so that we can ensure that there's more equity in the society in relation to our distribution or redistribute, even at justice level, redistributive justice. And on that score, just to finally state this, it has to come from a justice system that will not incarcerate. Even in America, I am reading this book where they're saying that the incarceration is like another kind of Jim Crow. Incarceration
It
of
is
black
another
people.
kind of Jim Crow. It's not.
Yes.
I mean, any system. Don't let me go on that. I was going to say any system that imprisons that such a high percentage of any ethnic group
Yeah.
must have a fundamental problem. But that can consume a whole
Yeah.
discussion by itself. Sorry, Professor Nihusu, you want
Yeah,
to
I
continue?
mean, yes, thank you very much. Kamraj, I do not share, well, let me put it this way. I have a more optimistic view of the Guyanese population than you appear to have. And I think that if people go to the Guyanese population and say we have to end this ethnic politics, more and more people are going to go for it. We have more than 70 years of ethnic politics to look back on. And I made a statement that Nigel read at the beginning of the last program that more and more Guyanese, and I think the experience of the AFC is partially is partial evidence of this. More and more Guyanese are willing not to vote race because people are not stupid. And if we give them the information and encourage them to think more and more, it's going to be a snowball. More and more people are going to move away from the ethnic trap because that's what it is. Today, my party is in power and I do everything for my group. Next day, somebody else's party is in power and they reverse all of that. Where is the country going? Where is merit going? Why can't we learn that difference is manageable? That difference must not automatically mean discord. And it's a fundamental weakness. Men and women are different. A man and his wife would have different of opinion. You and your best friend, whether or not your best friend is your husband or your wife, will have difference of opinion. So what is important is not the fact of difference, because that's natural. It's how we solve difference that is
Well,
important. We have to have a mechanism for solving difference.
okay. So
I'm
that
all right. Go ahead.
no,
I
no,
want to address something else.
no.
That,
Go ahead. Go ahead. Don't let me
that
stop you. I'll come back to
No,
that
go
question.
ahead. Go
Please.
ahead.
you see, we're talking about justice, and redistributive justice is what Kemrad said. This is an important concept, and it touches on something that you said before and triggered a memory. And I would have said this even if you hadn't gone on to mention redistributive justice. Equality is different from equity. And it's important that we understand this. You see, if, as it happened, for hundreds of years, African Guyanese have been more hamstrung than most other Guyanese as groups, to do justice to African Guyanese will not mean treating them equally as other Guyanese. It sounds like a strange concept to people. But if I have been injured, you see where I'm going now? In order to treat me right, you have to bring me up. You have to give me
That's right.
something extra that I needed. Okay? And, this brings us to the concept, to the question of reparations. And our nation needs to be educated on why African Guyanese need reparations, why it is just and honest. It's not that we're begging for something that we don't deserve. Every day in the courts, and you two lawyers know this, of the Western nation, there you practice something called tort. You say that if somebody is reckless and injures somebody else, then there are two things at least they need to pay for. One is the pain that they cause by that injury, and the other one is any loss of earnings and so on that the person must be compensated for. Think about the hundreds of years of deprivation that African people have suffered from, and you begin to understand. I don't want to go into the psychological ramifications and so on, but when we talk about redistributive justice and so on, that's one of the things we need to be very clear about. Here is something else. I heard a lot of dismissive talk recently from a minister of government in Guyana with regards to cooperative societies. And I ask myself whether that minister's utterance was informed by any understanding of the meaning and significance of the cooperative among African people in particular and Guyanese people in general. I don't want to make a long story out of this one, but the so called black villages, free villages in Guyana, were formed out of that cooperative spirit. Many families were launched into careers and house building and so on through a form of cooperative that African people brought with us from Africa called the box or box hand. In different Caribbean countries, they say susu, cash money in San Antonio, and so on and so forth. And we could go on and talk about
But
how the cooperative informed African Guyanese attempts to triumph over the limitations of our circumstances.
okay,
That's a whole not a discussion. But here my
so
point is, when we have responsible or ostensibly responsible people in our society making statements like that, they turn out to be reckless. That's the best you could say. I mean, you could accuse the person of being racially and culturally and ethnically insensitive and all that kind of stuff. I prefer to say that is a lesson for us to step back and try to understand our circumstances. People do not act in a vacuum. And the fact that so many people walked away from those cooperative lands should trigger an attempt to understand why, in the minds of people with responsibility. That's an approach I would recommend strongly. And let me just close this session, this thing on saying this. Ancestral land is part of that entire trust. And African Guyanese people have been disinherited by what you talked about, Kamraj, a British legal system that does not recognize African culture and therefore does not recognize ancestral lands among African people. I want to leave it there, but these are problems that we will have to face if we want to make a decent go at living together in Guyana and going somewhere as a nation.
I
And
have a
you
question,
know,
but just a footnote to what you said about legal systems recognizing ancestral lands. There was a recent decision that related to indigenous people, given by the Chief Justice in relation to the Akawayo and Arakuna peoples, where for the first time the court has recognized that the Akawayo and Arakuna peoples have occupied the Upper Mazaruni area from time immemorial and have given them non-exclusive Aboriginal title. That has to be fleshed out. So I think there's the basis to begin to expand
Definitely.
jurisprudentially
Mm.
the whole concept of ancestral land. Sorry, Kemrad, you're going to say something, and I want to come back to both of you
no, I
specifically.
was saying that these are powerful points being made by Dr. Nehusi here. And I immediately, it touched a sensitive spot in me. And I had to tell Aubrey Norton, who I sit next to, when the minister, I think it was Joe Hamilton, indicated that he's going to take away the crops if the land is not being tilled and all of that. And I spoke back to him and say, "What? That is Joe Hamilton himself. How could you do that? And who, which and
But
which
but but
co-ops
but
do you have in
Kemraj,
mind? It is
you've gone
important."
exactly to where I want to go to.
Okay.
In this present political system that we have, Rich rewards the winner, even if it's by a majority of one seat, which is what, 6,000 votes,
That's right.
with virtually the power to do everything, particularly at budget. How do the people who are disadvantaged because of their ethnicity, how do they resist in the present structure? Because you can talk about democracy and say, yes, you're elected, but is that taken to mean that you're elected to discriminate against me because more people voted for you? And my question to both of you is, I'm sure you've seen the publication I've done on economy and justice. You've
That's
seen
it.
the figures there. The government has not challenged any of the figures. They sought to explain it, but they haven't challenged it. So when you have that kind of information about the discriminatory allocation of the nation's resources, and it comes down to a vote where the government of the day has one seat or two seats advantage in parliament, and you are economically deprived by the policies of the government of the day, what are your options?
Well, Nigel, I must tell you, it is a difficult situation, but knowing very well that you have um, to persuade that they are wrong, you have to persuade
But Conrad, let's be real. Persuade who?
persuade the government of the day.
No.
And if they
When you give
don't,
me one example, one single example where this present administration,
yeah,
you
we
can't
might have
call
a problem there. We might have a
okay,
problem
you
there.
can't
But
you cannot talk about the Ramatara administration because he was a minority president.
minority,
And
yeah.
yeah, but go back. The Jagdeo has 2.5 terms that he had. Um, Janet Jagan, Chetty, you may say differently. Where has there ever been, and take even your administration, the APNU AFC administration, where has there ever been a persuasion as a result of a parliamentary debate on a point, and not a minor point, on a major
Well,
economic
we
issue?
have had very minor ones, like, the Cherry Jagan Institute that was being taken over. And then a lot of people said it is wrong to do what
Yeah, those
I
are, I'm
think.
talking about economic issues,
Yeah,
economic
well, that is the
allocation of
difficulty.
resources.
You're right about that. I mean, we had our problems, especially trying to remedy the situation. As you know, we had indicated to the sugar workers that every month for 36 months, $1 billion was being taken away from them. But they still wanted us to take it away to give to them, and we didn't have anything that left for the nurses and teachers and so on. So that is why we had to make certain decisions, and I think it was a good decision. A lot of people have come to appreciate it. But apart from persuasion, because
So are you
notwithstanding anything
conceding?
else,
Well, I just want to be clear. You are conceding that there has not been any example in
no, no, no.
contemporary Ghana. No, on
Nigel, there
economic
might
where
be
the
examples that
opposition.
I have overlooked and not prepared, or I might be ill-advised to say there are not any examples.
But surely
But
you'd remember them if they were of any moment.
yeah, well, that is what I'm telling you about, because
Hmm.
you had some people arguing that we should close down the entire industry. Some people persuaded us, hold on, let's right
Yeah.
size. You
But
know,
at the end of the day, it wasn't a result of a vote in parliament. That was because there were different views within your political party and the
well, you can
coalition.
say that.
Yeah.
But
So
I
my
must
my
tell you,
question is in the National Assembly, give me a single example on a major economic issue or allocation of resources where the opposition, whether the opposition was APNU AFC or the opposition was PPP, has actually been able to swing a vote in the National Assembly. Because you are going to say persuasion, but persuasion doesn't work if you have this system that we have where the leader can recall the speakers. All you have there is
no, no, no.
commitment.
I agree the difficulty. The Amila Falls was one, but we had a majority in the opposition
Yeah, that's
then.
why I said don't come to
Yeah.
Ramatar
Well, that is
time.
why I'm saying going on to another method. That is, you have to create some social reform movement in the process. And just like Black Lives Matter, they still have they're in a majority, but the cabinet of America, the president might very well listen. And
Kemraj,
so you
name
have,
me one civil society organization that is not politically biased,
no,
that is
it is
not perceived
all
as
of us have
all.
our biases,
So
but
that's
we
my
are just
point.
hoping that at least by virtue of creating movements, that you could make a difference. And
Give me one
hopefully,
that has made a difference in Guyana.
well, we did
Even
it.
let's pick the one that's perhaps the least politically motivated, the one that was the Denise Dias headed, the after her daughter was killed on the road, talking about.
Well, yes,
So
that also was an example. But you can say that by virtue of creating this social movement, like the Alliance for Change did, we created a 2011 scenario whereby in Parliament that now is avoided. You're right. If there's a majoritarian politics in a party like the PPP or even the PNC, you will have despotism. But that is why, indeed, when you create these persuasion, you persuade people and so on, and create the
But
social
all
movement.
I'm trying to get you to
Could I
say,
get a word in?
yeah, sure. But all I'm trying to get Kemraj to say is that there's no such thing as persuasive politics in Ghana. We never had it. Never.
I don't
No.
agree
Anyway,
with that.
anyway, go ahead, Nehusi, please.
You know,
I am probably
Comrade, the
a little bit
situation
more.
you're talking about, that 2011 situation, is exactly what I mean when I say that um, there is room, and it is not merely room, there's an imperative
That's right.
for Guyanese people to practice a different kind of politics.
Politics.
And I think that it's important for us to recognize that our political culture, let me double down on this, our political culture needs to be transformed. We are still in plantation politics, and the institutions of governance need to be transformed also. We cannot expect to keep a colonial inheritance to build what some of us call a post colonial society. It's a vulgarity, it's a contradiction. You have to keep changing for the better, and that means changing the instruments of governance and administration wherever necessary. And we shouldn't be afraid to make mistakes. What we should be afraid of is not doing anything and not constantly reviewing what we have done with an eye to fine tuning or changing whenever necessary. So for me, we've got to find a system that enables large numbers of people to exert influence on administrative decisions. And to put it in, this is going to be crude and inaccurate, but you'll grasp what I mean when I say that if it's an African Guyanese government, most Indians are left out. If it's an Indian government, most African Guyanese are left out. If it's an Indian Guyanese government, that's not true 100% anymore. In fact, it hardly ever was. But this is a majoritarian kind of thing we're talking about. And we've got to end that. We've got to stand up as a political class and say, we're not going for that. We're not going for ethnic cockfights, as George Lamming called them, and it's easy at the level of pronouncement, but we got to go and work among our people. This is what failed to take place. This is what we failed to do comprehensively in 1953 and before. And since then, we've been locked in to this national racial mobilization, especially at election time, with all the dog whistles, the unspoken things, and so on. And it's got to stop. Our country is going nowhere.
But you see, you make. I say this with great respect. Of course, we should always appeal to the best in ourselves. I absolutely agree with that. But the reality of politics, particularly in Guyana, is what is the incentive for the present government to move in that direction if they have continued to win elections doing the things they did?
Well, it's a beautiful question. The incentive is this: because you have a majority, never mind it's a slim one, you are in the best position to say, what do you want? I know you didn't vote for me, but what did you want? I am a servant of all the Guyanese people. This doesn't mean that you must desert your base and don't give them things that they need, but you have to be in service of the entire nation. And
I
I keep
understand
saying
that, but what's the incentive for that? In
I'm,
real
I'm
political
coming to it.
terms.
I'm coming to it. People are not stupid. And if you are consistent enough, you go to people, you explain to them, and you persuade them that you are allocating resources on the basis of need, ultimately enough people are going to vote for you. The alternatives are frightening. You want to create a whole class of disgruntled people. You're going to create a whole class of people who are deprived of opportunity. And they're going to know and understand that they're deprived of opportunity. You are creating social stress and national discord.
But
And I'll
we've
go
always
as
had
far as
that.
to say that internal
But haven't
behavior.
we always had that?
Sorry?
Haven't we always had that? This
Yeah, but
country
to
has
what
always
extent?
been, has, well, you can argue about degree,
But
but
no,
this
hold on,
country
hold
has
on. I am going to argue about degree because with the nation set to have a sudden injection of money, these fissures are going to be dramatized if we keep the current structures of resource distribution.
but my friend,
I'm not
if you
finished.
have, no, but I just want you to factor into that. If you have the resources, you can buy a lot of people who would
Look,
not traditionally, you can
look,
buy a lot of people.
I think you're talking about renting crowds now.
No, not crowds. I'm talking about buy a lot of people.
I don't agree with that because
Well, time
how
alone will
much
tell.
are you going to pay for people's conscience? How much are you going to pay people to forget that they took money from you and you did not fulfill all their needs?
All right. We have the
How,
example, and
let me finish. Let me finish,
let
please.
me just share the example with you.
How much are you going to persuade people that they got something, you give them something, but then there are other people over there and there and there who didn't get anything or who didn't get enough, and they steal their stuff, the social
Yeah.
stress boils over.
But let me answer that by saying this. The typical approach of all major political parties to the indigenous vote answers that question. What do? They go in, they give them tractors, they give them, they share out some money, and in real crude terms, because I've seen this, they go into villages, slaughter the bulls on the Sunday before the election, distribute the bulls throughout the entire village, and irrespective of how they might have treated those people for the last 4.5 years before elections, they win the vote on that. And that is a consistent pattern by the two major political parties. They go in, you suddenly start to see tractors going into villages, outboard engines going into villages. You see people going in and they're handing out T-shirts with $20,000 inside. And that is the classic example. All that will happen, it doesn't happen in the urban areas as much, but that is the way that I imagine a
My,
modern
my,
Guyana.
response, my response to that, Nigel, is that whosoever is in the opposition, whosoever is not the party doing that, perhaps is too much asleep and don't make the correct propaganda, we could call it, out of that. Because you need to explain not only to the Amerindian communities, but to the entire Guyana exactly what is going on there. And when I say people are not stupid, people would understand. People might take you $20,000 in the t-shirt. They're going to eat the meat from the bull. But they would understand that that's dangerous behavior because ultimately it's against the interests of even those people who accept that money. And this is what we have to go among people and explain. But we have not done that footwork. We have not done that grounding in our communities. It's hard work, but it's not impossible. And that's what our political class has got to do. And if people don't want to do it, those who undertake to do it are going to get there. And the AFC started to prove that. There were people who voted for AFC who, to a certain degree, were voting in a way that said, we don't want to take part in ethnic voting anymore. There were other factors in there, and you would know this better than I do. But you cannot interpret the votes the AFC got in a way that doesn't factor in, use your word, Nigel, the fact that people were, voting in this direction. And I think it's a trend that needs to be deepened and broadened and encouraged and insisted upon.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes left, and I do want to get this out for the viewers. Can you both of you give me your top 3 recommendations for how you begin to tackle the issue of race, not at a high level, but the issue of race in terms of practical terms, given the allocation of resources, the very poor state. As a matter of fact, deplorable was the word you used, Professor Nihusi, for the present state of race relations. And what would be the top 3 or 4 things that you would recommend immediately be undertaken at a national or political level? Same question to you, Kemraj. Who wants to go first?
Okay, I'll go. First thing is adequate emphasis on work, grassroots work. And that means going to people and educating them about the story of our country, the stories of each one of the groups, and therefore of the country. Adequate distribution or redistribution of resources.
How?
I wouldn't be adventurous enough to say that now it's something that needs to be studied, but people must get what they need from an administration. So things like paying for civic education, whether it's delivered in the schools and or in communities through radio stations, TV stations, and so on. We need to do those things. We need to place emphasis upon developing our people, the working people of Guyana. And we need to spend the money, do the resources to do that. We also need to make certain that we encourage a political culture that takes as its departure point the needs of the people. We just can't continue to play the race card. We have to talk about what our people need. We have to recognize genuine differences among our people. We've been shamed into this belief that somehow or the other, I can't say I'm an Indian Guyanese or I'm an African Guyanese or something like that. What's wrong with that? That's fact. And we have to educate our people to know our own stories. This is the way forward.
Thank you for that, Kemraj.
Yeah, I would want to endorse, of course, what Dr. Nihusi has indicated there, and to also state an education and constitutional reform. We cannot but, do the things that we've been doing all the time and expect different results. There is the requirement, and we had started a process, although we got it kind of exiting from it very early too. A constitutional reform process that can educate our people as to why we need to change. People seem to feel that now that we have the oil resources, there is no need to change. We got more resources now. And that is going to build the bridges, the roads, give the scholarships to whosoever want that, and so on. But I think fundamentally, education, civic education especially, that will take us forward is going to be very much important. We have to have, I feel, at even a grassroots level too, and that is where it is important, a need for, it is called a justice, understanding justice, as it were. It is part of the education, so that we do not, in any of our policies, seem to discriminate against the other. And it is going to be difficult to conceptualize, but I believe that with the resources and the expertise that we know that we have, we can work out something which will ensure, even if it comes down to an ethnic auditing system, just like every project that we'd have, you'd have to do an environmental impact assessment. For any policy arrangement, you do an ethnic audit in this scenario. And so the redistributive justice, as I call it, is also another fundamental that more work has to be put into. I mean, there are lots and lots of things that we can distribute equitably rather than equally, as was mentioned here by Dr. Nihusi, because equally means that everybody's starting off the race similarly, but that is not the historical evidence. There are some people who are far back as a result of their historical circumstances. And so that equitable distribution of resources is fundamental for us to ensure that we move forward and move along. Look, before I end here, I want to say thank you so much, Dr. Nihusi. I'm so proud the fact that the Alliance for Change has managed to get you, and of course to get Nigel Hughes here. And I want, I wanted to send you a thank you card by, but me ain't got none thank you card right now.
Kemraj thinks about in the AFC. You can't send a thank you card.
I didn't know this man was a googly bowler.
Thanks so much. And we're certainly going to take this to different levels. And I would want other experts to come in, who I'm certain myself or Nigel will get. Thank you so much.
Right. So Kemraj
Thanks
has actually usurped my role here as guest chair. But Professor, excellent. Thank you very much, Kemraj. Thanks. And again, I just want to say, my kudos goes out to the Alliance for Change for actually having taken this discussion, not just the first program, we've had the second, and I'm sure there will be several more in the series. Good night, everyone, and thank you for joining Alliance on the Move. Good night.
Good night, and take care, Doc.
Good night.